November 24, 2014. Employees at Sony Pictures arrived at work expecting a normal Monday morning. Across offices in Los Angeles, computers suddenly stopped working. Files disappeared. Systems refused to load. Then a strange image appeared on employee monitors. A red skull filled the screen. Beneath it was a message from a group calling themselves the Guardians of Peace. The hackers claimed they had taken control of Sony's entire network, and they said they had already stolen massive amounts of internal data. Private emails, financial records, passwords, even unreleased movies. The attackers warned that if Sony didn't obey their demands, everything would be made public. At first, many employees assumed it was some kind of internal IT issue, but it quickly became clear something much larger had happened. Within hours, Sony Pictures had effectively lost control of its own network. What investigators would soon discover was even more disturbing. It wasn't just a hack, it was an international cyber attack. This is the story of the Sony Pictures hack, and how a single movie triggered one of the most infamous cyber attacks in history. At the time, Sony Pictures was one of the largest film studios in the world. The company produced blockbuster movies, television shows, and some of Hollywood's biggest franchises. Millions of people around the world watched Sony's films every year. But in 2014, Sony was preparing to release a movie that would spark international controversy. The film was called The Interview. It was a comedy starring Seth Rogen and James Franco. The plot followed two journalists recruited by the CIA. Their mission was to assassinate North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Long before the movie was even released, the North Korean government condemned it. Officials called the film an act of war. They warned that the movie insulted the dignity of their leadership. Despite the warnings, Sony executives continued moving forward with the film's release. After all, controversial films were nothing new in Hollywood. Studios had dealt with protests before. But behind the scenes, something far more serious was already happening. Hackers had quietly infiltrated Sony's internal network, and they had been inside for months. For weeks, the attackers moved silently through Sony's systems. They studied the company's infrastructure. They mapped servers, copied files, and escalated their access. By the time Sony realized something was wrong, the attackers had already gathered enormous amounts of data. The hackers also prepared a destructive piece of malware. It was designed to cripple Sony's internal systems. Then, on the morning of November 24th, everything changed. Thousands of Sony employees suddenly lost access to their computers. Internal drives stopped responding. Servers across the company began shutting down. Employees restarted their machines, hoping the issue would disappear. Instead, they saw the same terrifying image: a red skull on a black screen, and a message from the Guardians of Peace. The attackers claimed they had stolen massive amounts of Sony's internal data: emails, financial records, passwords, confidential files. They warned Sony executives that if their demands were ignored, everything would be leaked. Within hours, panic spread across the company. Entire departments were suddenly unable to work. Email systems were offline. Internal communications collapsed. Sony Pictures had effectively been taken hostage. Within days, cybersecurity experts and federal investigators began analyzing the attack. Sony hired outside incident response teams to examine the damage. The hackers had not only destroyed Sony's internal systems, they had also stolen more than 100 terabytes of company data. Soon, the stolen information began appearing online. Private emails between Sony executives were published. Internal conversations about actors, salaries, and movie deals spread across the internet. The leaks quickly turned into a massive public relations disaster. Embarrassing emails became headlines around the world. But investigators were focused on something else: the technical fingerprints left behind by the attackers. Security researchers began analyzing the malware used in the breach. They noticed similarities with previous cyber attacks. Several attacks had targeted banks and media companies in South Korea. Those attacks had been linked to North Korean cyber operations. Investigators also studied the infrastructure used by the hackers. Servers and networks involved in the attack had connections to known North Korean systems. Slowly, a theory began to form. This attack might not have been carried out by ordinary criminals. It looked increasingly like a state-sponsored cyber operation. In December 2014, the FBI made a stunning announcement. After weeks of investigation, federal officials publicly blamed North Korea. Investigators said the evidence pointed strongly toward the North Korean government. They cited malware similarities, infrastructure links, and intelligence data. North Korea denied the accusations. Government officials called the FBI's claims a fabrication. But by that point, the damage had already been done. Thousands of confidential emails had been leaked online. Private conversations between executives, actors, and producers were now public. The attack also escalated beyond corporate embarrassment. The hackers began threatening movie theaters. They warned theaters not to show the interview. Some threats even referenced the attacks of September 11th. Many theater chains canceled screenings of the film. Facing pressure and security concerns, Sony initially pulled the movie from release. For a brief moment, a cyber attack had effectively stopped a Hollywood film from reaching theaters. It was an unprecedented situation. A digital attack had triggered an international political crisis. What made the Sony attack so destructive wasn't just the data theft. The attackers had also deployed a specialized piece of malware. This malware functioned as a wiper. Instead of encrypting files like ransomware, it erased them completely. Large portions of Sony's internal systems were permanently destroyed. Computers across the network had their data overwritten. Security researchers later discovered the malware had been carefully designed. It was programmed to spread across Sony's infrastructure before activating. Once triggered, thousands of machines became unusable almost instantly. Entire departments suddenly had no functioning computers. Recovery took weeks. Some systems had to be rebuilt from scratch. The attack showed a level of planning far beyond typical cybercrime. The attackers weren't just stealing information. They were trying to cripple the company itself. The Sony Pictures hack became a turning point for cybersecurity. For the first time, a cyber attack had disrupted a major entertainment company. It had embarrassed executives. It had influenced international politics. And it had nearly stopped a major Hollywood film from being released. The breach revealed just how vulnerable even large global corporations could be. Once attackers gained access to internal networks, the consequences could be enormous. Since the Sony hack, companies around the world have dramatically increased cybersecurity spending. Governments have also taken cyber warfare far more seriously. Because the lesson was clear. In the modern world, cyber attacks don't just steal data. They can disrupt industries, influence politics, and change global events. Sometimes wars don't begin with bombs. Sometimes they begin with code. Sometimes they begin with code.